Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Okay. So, howdy, folks. Today, we're talking about one of my favorite topics, but it also is it's a topic that is probably still holds probably the most uncertainty around mechanism. But in that being said, I think if you logically think about concurrent training and you observe what goes on in nature, you literally understand concurrent training. Looking at a sprinter versus an endurance runner, what are the body types? What are the types of training that they do? How do they respond to that? And there's just a million different things within concurrent training that if you just sit down and think about them, they make sense. And the reason why they seem to work that way in the research is, maybe not well understood, but it seems to follow this underlining natural guiding principles of biology to some degree.
Right. Yeah, the specificity.
Exactly.
Specificity is key to all adaptations.
Yeah, exactly. So what I want to kind of parse out right now, I think everyone's going to probably learn some really cool stuff in this podcast about concurrent training. But what I want to kind of start with a definition versus my concept of concurrent training. And, the research that we're going to talk a lot about today is essentially splitting endurance training and strength power training into kind of like a 50-50 category. So what I'm not talking about today is being a professional cyclist or maybe an amateur runner and, running 20 hours a week and running 15 hours a week and strength training like twice or three times.
Yeah.
That I would consider supplemental training.
Right.
So and I think even though if that's your jam, if that's what you're doing, you're still going to learn a ton today about some certain responses that we're seeing in the research.
Yeah.
So don't kind of be thrown off by this, but this would be considered like the hybrid training. So stuff you're seeing like Fergus Crawley do, and the other guy, I can't remember, he did the 5-minute mile and the 500-pound back squat too.
Oh, Ryan Hall.
No, not Ryan Hall. There's another guy that did it before Ryan.
I know who you're talking about.
What I'm talking about?
Yeah. He was a CrossFitter.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember his name either.
Forgetting his name.
Yeah.
Sorry to that guy.
DM us if you know his name, because we're blanking right now. But yeah, this is for a lot of people. I think CrossFit athletes would highly benefit from this discussion. High rocks athletes, I mean, like combat sport athletes, Matt, like you were into, and that's why you got into a lot of the concurrent training literature. Because the fear is that if you need to be super strong for your sport and you're also partaking in a lot of endurance training, you may or may not be hindering those strength adaptations that you are trying to get and keep.
For sure. And one of the things I'm seeing now too is I see this big movement of strength training for endurance athletes, right? Where we're seeing this kind of like push, like, oh, everyone needs to be strong to go fast or to like run long or be more economical. And I agree with a lot of that. But I also want to throw out some of the stuff out there where it's like, if your main goal is to go fast and your main goal is to like run long distances, like I want to talk a little bit about these limits that we're seeing here in the research and being like, oh, hey, it looks like if you're doing this much, it's most likely going to interfere to some degree. So yeah, let's start off with actually kind of a story of how this whole thing started. And this was from Robert Hickson, which is a beast in exercise physiology. And he's published some crazy papers out there on like Vo2 max, which we mentioned in a previous study where he had people like doing like a crazy training program and they seen like huge Vo2 max increases in like 10 weeks that has like never been
wasn't it like 30 or 40% in like 10 weeks because they were doing just like insane amounts of training at or close to Vo2 max.
Yes. So this guy back again, Robert Hickson, a beast, is back with a similar study now. So what the problem was that Hickson came across was he was a power lifter, and he went to do basically his postdoc work with another famous professor called John Hollisley. So this guy was kind of like the endurance guy, right? Like
Yeah.
everyone knew Hollisley as the
Yeah.
guy to go to for endurance exercise
He's
research.
he's the guy that first showed that your mitochondria, your enzymes actually get better and your mitochondria get bigger with endurance exercise.
Yes, this guy's found a lot, like a lot of the stuff that we kind of push off of today or hold as base knowledge. It's from this guy.
Yeah.
So he wanted to kind of like, butter up his professor and be part of the team. So he went out there and put the miles down. And even though he's a power lifter, he was going out there and running with the professor. But what he found was that even though he was still like, training hard in the gym, that this increase in running was taking away from his strength. So, he went out and kind of talked to the professor about it and said, look, I think that I'm getting some type of interference effect essentially from all this running, and I'm seeming to get, I'm losing some strength here. So then he decided that, this would be a good thing to go out and study. So what he did was he took 3 groups. So one group just did strength training, the next group did just endurance training, and the third group did both, right? So concurrent. And basically the strength training group, what they did was they, 5 days a week, and basically they were just like max effort lifts, basic powerlifting stuff, but kind of an extreme version of powerlifting. So they were doing that, 5 days a week. And then the endurance group, they basically trained 6 days a week, and 3 days was cycling, 3 days was running. Now this is the crazy part, right? So what they were doing was, for the cycling protocol, they were doing 6 5-minute intervals at VO2 max, right? So 3 days a week. And then for the runs, they were doing 30 minutes as fast as possible per day, right? And then that increased to 35 minutes and 40 minutes, which is insane, right? Like it's like how the these
How did he
guys
get
are just like,
anybody through these studies? Like
I know.
I had trouble getting people through 7 sessions of 10 minutes at 90% heart rate, or 1
Yeah.
minute at 90% heart rate, 1 minute rest 10 times. And he's
Yeah.
over here, doing something that would probably kill me after the first day.
Yeah.
And it's
There's just like back then, it's just a different type of society. Like, you can't trick someone into doing that nowadays because there's
no,
the internet and people are like, screw this, right?
right.
So yeah, and basically, what the concurrent training group did was kind of a mixture of both, right? So they did both the strength and they did the endurance protocols, right? So they didn't. This is the crazier
They mix
part,
both of them.
that they mixed both of them together, and they
Yeah.
did both of them to full degrees. And they had like 2 hours of rest in between them.
Adequate.
Yeah. So what they found was at the end of the 10-week program, the VO2 max, that which they did on the bike and the treadmill, for the strength training group, they showed a 4% improvement in VO2 max. And we're going to get to why they might have seen that, which is, there's a lot of things in my mind that I've been kind of postulating over the years. But in the treadmill, there was no difference in VO2 max. Now that was a strength training group. Now for the endurance and concurrent training group, both of these groups, they had a 17% increase on the treadmill and a 20% increase on the bike, right? So both of them had similar improvements in VO2 max. But one thing that the strength training didn't really negatively affect the concurrent training group until later on in the study. So like it was equal. The concurrent group was equal to the strength training group up until like the 6th and 7th week of the study.
Mm-hmm.
Then their strength started to get impaired. And this is going to make sense for what we're going to talk about later as well. So yeah, basically, but it wasn't to a large degree. So they did get stronger. They got much stronger. It's just that there was a slight bit of adaptation that was kind of lost in the last few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So this was really what pulled the trigger for every concurrent study that we've seen to this point now. This was the guy that started it all off. And this is where we hear the interference effect being thrown out there. This is where we hear like, oh, strength training is bad for your, endurance performance, or vice versa. Endurance is
Mm-hmm.
bad for your strength. This was kind of like where this all started. So bringing it into today, we've now had several of these studies gone through. We've had several reviews. We've had several studies on molecular mechanism. We've had several studies on, sequence of endurance and strength training and how they should be sequenced, frequency, also modality, the differences between cycling and running, swimming and rowing, all these different things, right? We've really kind of got a lot of information, but the point that we're at right now, we still don't have a lot of molecular mechanism really well understood.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few little markers that we do kind of know somewhat well, but when you start to dig into the research, you realize like, hey, it's not that. And I'm sure you could talk to that, Phil. Like you probably see stuff in research all the time where it's like, you hear people state like, hey, yeah, we know the molecular mechanisms behind all this and that,
Yeah.
but you realize on a different level, it's like, we actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I can go into that a little bit. So, something, I mean, kind of like this first paper that we're talking about, right? Hickson took these people through a pretty incredibly challenging, regiment of training over 10 weeks. And, it's not surprising that, with this sort of stuff, you see some level of interference effect, right? Because the sheer amount of volume and load that this concurrent training group was undergoing, it's a lot. There's probably going to be some level of maladaptation going on. And then, so then what happens is people are like, well, we're really interested in looking at exploring the mechanisms behind why this may be occurring. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times, and this is kind of where my research during my PhD kind of comes in, is we see, or what we'll do as researchers is we'll say, oh, well, we've identified these pathways, mTOR and AMPK being two of the major energetic and protein synthesis signaling pathways within the skeletal muscle. And people will tag these, and then they'll be like, okay, well, now let's take a group of mice and let's overexpress a certain protein, something that is related to AMPK or mTOR. Let's get rid of a certain protein. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is, based on this non-physiological response, like you can't just like take a human and knock out a piece of AMPK, they would die. You could try to do some CRISPR gene editing, but then you get into like the ethical nature of human engineering and all of that sort of stuff. And what we do is we take these mouse studies and then we use them sometimes as gospel of this protein is the only thing that is important for a certain function. So mTOR, right? It's the master regulator of muscle protein synthesis. So when you knock out certain pieces of it, muscle protein synthesis goes down. AMPK, in a similar vein, is a bioenergetic sensor. So when you knock out pieces of it, the ability to signal these bioenergetic stress pathways goes down. The challenge is that knocking something out in a mouse is totally different than activating or decreasing these protein responses in humans with exercise or sedentary behavior. And they're not going to react to the same extent. So one example that Matt was just telling me about is that, there's researchers, and I don't know this paper specifically, that have, knocked out certain portions of AMPK. And what they find is that even with exercise training, these mice are still able to have mitochondrial biogenesis. So their mitochondria are still able to respond and get better. And all this time, people have been thinking AMPK is this, super, super important protein for mitochondrial adaptation and all of that. So what I'm getting at is that, take the molecular response papers with a grain of salt, because they're not physiological. When you're knocking out or knocking in or activating or whatever it is. Also, mice are not humans. And then the third point is that within our cells, we have so many redundant pathways that even when we knock something out that should be super, super important for, a certain signaling cascade, our body has so many redundant mechanisms that you're still able to respond. So the bottom line is we don't fully understand all of these signaling cascades. We have some level of idea, but take all these with a grain of salt, especially when we're looking at mouse studies and trying to translate them into human research.
Yeah, that was a good stream there, because I've listened, I'm sure you've listened to several podcasts where people, especially when it's surrounding hybrid training, they talk about this interference effect, and they like, me and Phil were talking about this before the podcast started. Like, I've heard several scientists say they know, oh, this sequence, it has to be strength training and then endurance versus strength training in this order, and it has to be at this amount of time because we know molecularly that this knocks it. And it's like, yeah, to some degree we do know that, and there's very, very little human science done on molecular mechanism. Like, there's very few biopsy studies done on concurrent training.
Yeah.
So people taking all this stuff from mice, I get where they're coming from. Like, yeah, there's, like Phil said, it can help us understand, but it's very different. And not only that, the more that's done on mice, a lot of the arguments that were people making for like certain sequences of training and certain things like, oh, it has to be this way, aren't actually holding up anymore. So when we're talking about hybrid training, what I really want to focus on today is, what are we actually seeing in the field and research? Like, what are we seeing the results on a hard metric level? I'm not like, we can get into AMPK and, stimulation of hepatic fatty acids and, ketogenesis and, fatty acid oxidation, all these different things. And the same with mTOR, we can get into like, the mechanical stimuli versus leucine and how those are different, and how long that turns on mTOR for. And we can get into all that, but it's not really useful to anyone because no one knows the fuck they're talking about when it comes to this stuff, to be honest with you. From what I've read, maybe I'm wrong on that, but so we're not going to sit here and pretend like we know. Because I just don't think anyone knows at this point.
Yeah, there's certainly some good hypotheses, and don't get us wrong. Like, I totally appreciate all of the molecular work that actually has to go into trying to figure out whether or not these pathways are activated, how they're activated, to what extent they're activated, all of that. From an applied side, it's not as relevant. Because there are things like we'll talk about, like maintaining adequate energy intake that are going to, potentially affect this interference effect a lot more than, whether or not you're activating mTOR enough or whether or not you're overstimulating AMPK. So that's kind of our bent is from the application side of things. What can you do as a coach or an athlete? But we do recognize that, this sort of molecular research, it is very important, just because, if you can start to understand the mechanisms and the pathways behind why and how we adapt to certain things, maybe we can have targeted interventions for them. So there is importance to them. It's just from the context of this podcast, we're going to try to talk more along the applied side of things.
Yeah. So we'll get into basically one of my kind of favorite reviews which is a brief review on concurrent training from laboratory to field. And essentially what this is doing is taking, you know, all the research out there on concurrent training and, you know, really kind of whittling away what is applicable, what are we seeing in response. So one thing, let's just get in right off the bat, is in this paper, the majority of the concurrent training interventions, muscle hypertrophy, strength, and power adaptations were mostly attenuated compared with those after isolated strength training stimuli. So if you're comparing concurrent training, you know, just to someone going out there and strength training only, some of these were, you know, attenuated. Some of these adaptations were attenuated. But on the other side of that, what he talks about in this paper is also there's several other studies that show that this was not the case. So right off, I'm starting with the quagmire. Well, you just said that, yes, they're attenuated. Well, in other studies, they're not. And the reasons why these make sense is because what we're really going to get into is frequency, you know, the spacing, sequence, and also the ratio of training.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I want to say, depending on what study you read, you really have to take everything into consideration of what were they studying, what were the lengths of intervention, what was the level of training history with the athletes that were involved, were they
Mm-hmm.
moderately trained? So let's just start with what we see with, you know, individuals that are non-trained, right? Because this will help. And individuals that have low exposure to whether it's strength training or endurance training, but they do one or the other on the other side. So what we know is that whenever they study kind of molecular mechanism on that side of things, like whenever you're a strength trained athlete and you go out there and do an endurance exercise, you're still going to see kind of mTOR being activated. And that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Like when you hear about Evan, you know, talking about the responses, and I've seen this as well. It's like people that are very well strength trained, when they go on and do a run or they go into cycling, you can see their muscle kind of responding to it like they're in the gym, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they're getting, you know, some of these vascular occlusions quite early on in the training. So there's a lot of reason to think like, yeah, this is why when you go out and you run for the first time or cycle for the first time, your muscles are super sore. It feels like you worked out. And it's a very similar response. Vice versa, someone that's very well endurance trained that goes and lifts weights, just like we've seen in that study, well, not in that study specifically, but you're still seeing some of that PGC1 alpha activation, right? And so this is where it kind of gets tricky. It's like, yeah, we're seeing that. We're seeing AMPK kind of respond to it. So it does, just to go out there and say, and someone that has exposure to neither strength training or endurance, they just see everything activated. And that's why you see people that literally just come off the couch, their VO2 max goes up when they lift weights.
Yeah.
Or when they go run, they get stronger, right?
Yeah. Because their bar is so low compared to everything else that any sort of stimulus that they have is going to increase everything. Whereas it makes sense that, or, you know, anecdotally speaking, so I have an endurance background and it's always been insanely hard for me to build muscle. So, you know, from that endurance perspective, right, you know, like moderately trained to well-trained endurance athlete, definitely at some more so at some points in my life, but then going into the weight room and, you know, even engaging in moderate to heavy lifting training, it makes sense that my body probably has mechanical adaptations, efficiency adaptations to kind of work towards stimulating more of those pathways that are generally activated with endurance training versus somebody who's on the flip side of things that's done a lot of strength training in the past. You know, their body is going to be more readily responsive with, say, like protein synthesis and, you know, accrual of proteins, just because that's kind of what environment their body has always been in. So that's really interesting because something we talk about with Moxie is like pulmonary limited athletes versus cardiac limited athletes. And I've talked to Evan about this quite a bit, is generally cardiac limited athletes are kind of those like meatball looking, super strong, muscular CrossFit athletes. They don't have any issue, building muscle or anything like that. Pulmonary limited athletes, and I don't really know why it's like cardiac and pulmonary, but the pulmonary limited athletes are more of the like a little bit lankier, harder to build muscle, like those sort of things. And they can generally, do 80 or 90% of their 1 rep maxes for forever. Whereas the cardiac limited athlete can only do, like they're your explosive athlete. They can do like 5 reps at their 1 rep or close to their 1 rep max, and then they're toast for the rest of the day. So it's just, it's interesting, and it's something to take into context is the training history and historical context of wherever that your athlete is coming from. So
because you are untrained, like if you, like, for example, like an endurance athlete that's very well trained goes into a weight room, they're now an untrained athlete for what they're doing. So they're going to see this cascade event of everything kind of going on because they're relatively just as untrained as the person that comes off the couch with regards to that type of stimuli.
Right.
So that type of stimuli is going to engage a ton of different mechanisms because it's just this new response. And that's why, but yeah. So, and then also what we see is, for example, we see higher, let's just get this mechanism stuff out of the way. You're going to see higher, activations of some of these things if you're non-familiar too. So for example, if you go in the weight room, you're going to see higher activations of mTOR. If you're an endurance athlete, and vice versa. If you're a resistance train athlete, you're going to see higher activation of AMPK. And this kind of makes sense. This is what I was trying to talk about. There's these kind of laws in nature. If you were just to go think about walking into a weight room as an endurance train athlete, you're going to see a ton of gains compared to, if you'd been in the weight room for, 10, 20 years. So this makes sense. And this is why I'm like, I don't want to talk about mechanism, but I just kind of want to kind of get it out of the way so we can start focusing on like, hey, what we're seeing is actually probably related to stuff that, might be in the background, even though we don't understand it that well. So now let's get into, kind of the frequency. So what we do see is whenever we're talking about, the frequencies of training, there seems to be like, a total volume effect, right? So under a certain amount of volume a week, right, you are going to see essentially zero interference effect, quote unquote interference effect. But once you start to raise that volume up over a certain threshold, you are going to see kind of an interference effect. And that's what we've seen in the Hickson paper, right? Like up until those last few weeks, that volume was starting to increase where it's like, oh, you are starting to see an interference effect. So it's not necessarily how much volume you're doing of both. It's how much volume you're doing in total. Because if you're a cyclist that's training 35 hours a week, if you add 5-6 hours of strength training onto that, you're going to see an interference effect. Right. It's because you're already at a very high total volume versus if you were, only training, a couple hours of cycling a week and you added 5 hours of strength training, you're not going to see an interference effect because there's that volume threshold is so low. So on the flip side of that, what are kind of the considerations to take when we're talking about volume? So if we're already an athlete that, for example, I'm a cyclist and or I'm a strength athlete and I want to do some type of endurance and not have any type of an interference effect. Well, we would probably want to keep, if we're doing moderate exercise, it under 3, 20 to 30 minute sessions a week. We kind of want to keep it under that level if we're talking about moderate intensity, because we are going to see a bigger interference effect dependent on the modality of endurance that you're doing. So moderate intensity aerobic endurance versus high intensity basically endurance exercise, they're two different stimuluses, and that makes sense when you're talking about pressing really hard into the pedals. The rate of force development, the neurological output, a lot of that's similar to weightlifting. So if we're to do a long session on the bike, you're giving two different stimuluses, and your body likes to have a single stimulus to kind of follow at once. You don't want to draw the organism in two different directions, right? The further you're drawing the two directions away from each other, kind of, long, slow distance versus kind of like very heavy, powerlifting style, Olympic lifting style, there's going to be a bigger interference effect. So if you can
more risk of interference effect. Yeah,
exactly. So if you can shape the exercises to be similar to each other, that's better. Mm-hmm. And also it's modality driven too. So when we talk about what we see with cyclists versus runners, there's actually quite a bit of different responses we see there. So for example, cycling does not appear to impair strength training adaptations as much as running does. And there's probably several reasons for that. One being that cycling, like we said, is kind of more similar to what you would do in the weight room in terms of like exercising your leg muscles. But two, the types of contractions are different, right? When we're talking about cycling, there's just this concentric movement over and over again. And there's kind of a longer stimulus to the muscle during each pedal stroke versus running, where there's this very, very brief moment where you're coming in contact with the ground. And they call it eccentric, but it is quasi isometric eccentric, because you're actually locking your quadriceps in kind of place, like to lock your lower limb in place. And yeah, it is kind of an eccentric movement, but a lot of it depends on your running style, how eccentric that is. But what we see with that is much higher rates of muscular damage in running versus cycling, right? And the inflammatory markers are higher, the muscle stress is higher, right? The muscle damage is higher, everything's higher with running.
Going back to like the molecular mechanisms, is AMPK activation higher with running? Like say if you tried to control for same power output or something like that, would you have more activation of bioenergetic stress signaling? And the reason I ask is because maybe one of the reasons that you're seeing more of an interference effect with running is because it's such a full body workout.
Yeah.
And then with like all the damage that's being accrued and all that sort of stuff, perhaps your caloric expenditure before, during and after the actual running is a lot higher compared to cycling. I don't know. That's just a
no, hypothesis. You're not off on that. There's actually slightly different signaling from running than there is from cycling.
Yeah.
And there, I can't remember the paper. There is something on PGC1 alpha response from running and cycling. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the paper. I know there is differences there. I know there was like massive differences there in signaling, and obviously it makes sense. Because even if you just look at like an endurance cyclist versus a runner, there are two different body types. You see much more hypertrophy in the cyclist than you do in the runner.
Yeah, especially in like even the thighs.
Exactly. First, like even for a track cyclist versus a sprinter in running, sprinters in running are very, very muscular, but a track cyclist is on the orders of magnitude much higher amounts of hypertrophy, especially in the legs. Even in the upper body, it's insane. And obviously that's due to their training and a lot of other things like in the weight room too. But I know for a fact, I mean, there is obviously much to be understood there. There is quite different signaling going on from running and cycling in terms of some of the specific markers anyways, in regards to PGC1 alpha. But so you're going to see different interference depending on the modality. So that's another thing. Like if you're just an hybrid athlete and you don't really care, and you just want to get fitter, or you're looking to like maximize your strength gains at a certain period of your training, whether it's for CrossFit, High Rocks, even if you're endurance athlete or you're a strength athlete looking to kind of, or a hockey player, whatever it is, team sport athlete, knowing that yes, cycling is going to aid in your resistance training adaptations much better than running will. We also see on this flip side of that too, is like there's actually higher fat loss with runners, even though it's only a slight amount, than with the same, basically same kind of volume with cycling. So if you're looking to like keep weight down, maybe as a fighter, that's a consideration to take, or a weight category thing. That's a consideration to take too. Like if you're trying to build some aerobic base, but you're also looking to lose a little weight. And that's something I've anecdotally seen in myself. I've never lost weight cycling. No matter how much I cycle, I've never lost weight cycling.
Yeah.
If I go out and run for literally a week, it's, you know, night and day difference. Like it's 10 pounds down for sure. And a lot of that's water weight. I'm very well aware most of that's water weight, but this caloric expenditure of running versus cycling for me, it's, you know, you're using a lot more muscle mass.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to add on to that, I've seen similar things where you know, I being a leaner guy, I always fluctuate between like wanting to build muscle and then feeling like I get, you know, too big and then wanting to lose weight. Like there's like three stages every single, you know, it's like multiple times per year. And one of the things I always try to figure out, it's like, oh, well, what's the most effective for trying to like lean out? And when I've been the most lean, I have been I just like introduce like 10 to 20 minutes of jogging before pretty much all of my CrossFit workouts. And I hadn't really like connected those dots until like right now, but I'm like, yeah, that's typically when I've been the leanest. I've been, you know, just like adding on an extra 10 or 20 minutes of running every single day, or, you know, every day that I go to the CrossFit gym. So again, from that perspective, you know, since it is a little, you know, it's full body workout, a little bit less efficient, more muscle damage, you're probably going to have higher caloric expenditure during those sort of things. And, you know, that's one of the huge potential drivers of this interference effect that we're finding, especially with the higher volume.
So while we're on caloric expenditure, you know, one of the things that they've noticed in some of these studies too is that, you know, lean body, like essentially lean mass and our body mass, or sorry, fat mass was decreased much more in as the higher intensity training was kind of focused on. So essentially the more volume of high intensity training that was incorporated into the total volume, the lower amount of adipose tissue was seen, right? And this makes sense because when we talk about endurance training, everyone says, oh, you got to exercise at your fat max because it's like the most metabolically, you know, efficient way to burn fat.
Because you're burning the most fat, right?
Yeah, but and we definitely don't see that. You go look at a sprinter versus a long distance runner, you know, two completely different looking athletes in terms of fat mass. You know, and I'm not saying that you don't see some endurance runners that are ripped to shreds, but just like what we see in nature, we can be fairly well assured that, oh yeah, that probably makes sense. I don't see a lot of fat sprinters. And not that that's the reason why they're skinny, or not the reason why they're super lean, but it has something to do with it, because whenever you do reach these higher intensities, your total daily metabolic expenditure ends up being cranked up for quite some time after the exercise, versus when you hit those lower intensities, you're burning more and everyone's probably heard of this. I don't need to say this, but everyone's probably heard this, but it is something to keep in mind. You know, when we're talking about weight loss, because this is some of the reasons why people do endurance exercise.
Yeah. The best thing I've heard is that endurance exercise is a really good way to manually burn calories. Whereas like kind of like strength training, high intensity interval training, sprint training, whatever you want to do, is a better way to burn calories consistently, because you're maintaining muscle mass. You're you know, like muscle mass is expensive to maintain on your body. And you know, it's like there's been, you know, some companies that we won't mention that have made livings off of this. You burn more calories after doing a high intensity interval training session or whatever it is. And largely that's minimalistic. That's like 48 calories difference or something if you actually calculate it. But one of the underlying benefits of high intensity training is that maintenance of muscle mass, which again, over time is going to allow for, you know, greater, what would it be like, calorie burn while you're not doing
long-term caloric expenditure.
Exactly.
And that's what we're seeing now with the new research is like, yes, especially with Herman Poncer. I'm not saying everything. I'm just throwing his stuff out there. is, your body is going to adapt to the expenditure that you place on it every day. So if you want to go out and run for 6 hours to lose weight, your body's going to find a way to try and bring it back to homeostasis. So all your NEAT, like your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is going to basically drop down. You're not going to move around as much.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to spend a ton of mental effort just to get up off the couch, because your body's going to try and conserve energy in any other way it can. It's going to slow your metabolic rate down. When I do RMRs on people, by far, people with the highest metabolic rates are always the people with the most amount of muscle mass. Essentially, like even taking two people that are at 200 pounds or 170 pounds, the person with more muscle mass has dramatically higher rates of caloric expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that in practice as well. And you're right, it is an expensive adaptation. And it's like, you're basically, what you're doing when you're trying to lift weights to become leaner is like, you're essentially trying to cheat the system. Like you're trying to like put on this thing that's super, super like costly and high maintenance and blah, 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 blah. So you can like kind of gain some benefits on the other side of that. Right. Like
right.
It's kind of cool. So yeah, talking now a little bit about like, if you're an endurance athlete, like if you're more on the endurance side of things, I've seen studies that show with cyclists specifically, and taking 30%, maybe it was runners, taking 30% of their total volume, and this is amateur cyclists or runners, I believe, taking 30% of their total endurance volume out and replacing that for strength training, improve their performance, or it was fairly closely matched in performance. Like there was no detriment to that. If it might have slightly improved that. But another thing is like, when we're talking about endurance athletes lifting weights, there doesn't seem to be an increase in mitochondrial density when you lift weights. Because even if you look at like an endurance athlete and you look at the amount of mitochondria in the muscle fiber, that there's much higher amounts of muscle or mitochondria in the muscle fiber.
Right.
Versus when we're talking about a strength train athlete, they actually have lower amounts of mitochondria density than a sedentary person or a person in the general population, which was counterintuitive what I've seen before and what I've heard people say before. I used to think that if you lifted weights, you're building more mitochondria in your type 2A fibers. And it's like,
I think it really depends, on like what sort of strength training stuff you're doing. I don't have studies to support this, but I bet somebody who's doing like crazy well, if you have more hypertrophy, you're going to have larger muscle volume, which could inherently dilute your mitochondrial volume density.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean that your mitochondria can't do. Yeah, that doesn't mean that your mitochondria aren't functional. Because compared to those sedentary individuals, I can almost guarantee you that your mitochondria are going to be in a better shape, and better position, than those sedentary. But that's interesting.
Yeah. And like I'm saying, I'm not saying like for people out here to be like, oh, I shouldn't be lifting weights. It's just that when we're talking about like these fibers, one thing I've always heard is like, hey, we want, a high amount of type 1 fibers. And I believe that. But what is super interesting is, one of the kind of mechanisms that they believe improves endurance athletes' performance is the increase of type 2A fibers. So when they're seeing improvements in like 15 minutes or 30 minutes time trials or whatever it is, whatever type of testing they're doing, they're thinking it's because they're, increasing the, type 2 fiber size, which is kind of counterintuitive, like to what a lot of people say. It's like, oh, you don't want a lot of type 2 fibers. But maybe it's just the increasing the size that is the important part to be kind of honing in on. It's like, maybe that is kind of the thing. It's like, you don't want to increase the amount of type, and we're obviously hyperplasia is not like, it's not really a sensible adaptation to kind of be seeking, but increasing the size doesn't seem to like, change performance.
Well, and
for the most part anyways.
Yeah, to go along with that, right? What I kind of teach in my exercise physiology class is like, type 2A fibers especially have a remarkable ability to adapt to whatever stress is placed upon them. So they can, have very good hypertrophy, if you're doing a lot of strength training, and they can also have a lot of mitochondrial biogenesis or mitochondrial hypertrophy if you're, placing a lot of endurance adaptations onto that. I can see one of the benefits to performance, with more functional type 2A fibers being that type 2A fibers are inherently, they're fast switch fibers, right? So they have higher power output. So having more of them and more efficient type 2A fibers could lead to, better force development with similar amounts of, say, like mitochondrial volume density. So the ability to drive, ATP from oxidative phosphorylation. So that could be one of the factors that's playing in there. Yeah. So I think, that's I think we've kind of deviated a long way from concurrent training in a sense, but let's talk like practicality. Cause I've had people reach out to me who, CrossFitters, Hyrox athletes, especially, who are concerned about the interference effect. And I think one of the bottom lines here is that unless you're doing a high amount of volume, you're probably not going to have much of an interference effect as long as you're eating adequate amounts of calories. Excuse me. But for somebody who is, on that, say, approaching elite level of CrossFit, Hyrox, any sort of hybrid sport, the question then becomes, what is it I can do to minimize the potential for this interference effect? And the answer, like in most things physiology, is it depends. So for example, there was a CrossFit athlete who reached out to me who is concerned about interference effect. And especially when you're getting to that elite level, right? With CrossFit, you're doing, I don't know, maybe like 2-3 WODs a day. And even though the research may be a little bit inconclusive when it comes to this, I always recommend to people, if there is a certain adaptation that you need to target, say for instance, you want to get stronger as a CrossFit athlete, have that be the first thing that you do if you're going to engage in some level of concurrent training. So for instance, if an athlete came to me as like, hey, I want to develop my strength a little bit more as a CrossFit athlete, I would, put them on, like a heavy strength training regimen. And then I would have either one of two things occur. If they can't space out their workouts at least 3 hours, I would have them do their strength training and then have them do some level of, like sprint interval training, high intensity interval training, something like that, in order to minimize on a bike or on on some sort of machine, in order to try to maximize the strength gains that you're going to get and minimize any interference from the actual Metcon that they're doing.
Yeah, no, that's good. And what the research shows and is applicable, what I've seen is when you're spacing out exercise, the higher volume that you have in terms, and it becomes harder. Like if you're training more in a week, it becomes harder to space things out more, but you need more space because you want to try and create more space. Example, if you're, we'll use the CrossFitter athlete. If you're talking about trying to run and strength train on the same day, let's just take WOD aside. If you're on a volume of 15 plus hours a week of training, there's research to show the further that you space those out, the more dramatic, of adaptations you're going to yield from that. So essentially, the further that you can, up to 24 hours, up to even 48 hours, and that's not reasonable for people, but if you can find a training modality that you can do in the morning that is opposite to the training modality that you're doing in the evening, that is the best possible way to structure it in your day. Now that's not possible for most people, especially people trying to work jobs and be professional athletes at the same time. Like it's just like you have to kind of do it when you can do it. Or if you have a family that kind of mitigates you kind of scheduling it in, you just have to jam it in, that's fine. But for example, what would be better is instead of mixing your training every day, would be one day doing strength, one day doing endurance, or one day doing, WODs, and then one day doing the activity that you're trying to build, whether that's endurance or strength base. Is if you can space those out, because you will yield better adaptations. It's the same concept of like, if you want to be a sprinter, you don't sprint every day, right? You sprint once every other day, if that. So if you're trying to yield adaptations, you kind of want to, for example, like you can go do hypertrophy one day and then you go lift really heavy the next day. Those are kind of two different adaptations. And that's why you see it always kind of done that way in whatever type of training. And same with endurance training. Like, endurance is a little bit different, but you do a lot of low level and low intensity work. And then the opposite days, you kind of do some maybe moderate intensity, or sorry, heavy intensity or high intensity. So trying to space out your sessions is a big one. And the more you can space them out, the better your adaptations are going to be. And the less interference of neuromuscular you're going to see. That's the big thing. It's like what you're seeing when you're seeing an interference effect a lot of the times is neuromuscular fatigue. So if you go out and run before you lift, you're not going to be able to get as much out of that weightlifting session versus if you had just, not done it at all or done it much longer beforehand. So yeah, that's one thing that can take into consideration.
Well, here's a question that I'll pose to you. So say for instance, you had somebody, come to you and you're like, hey, essentially what you are recommending right now is like, let's reduce the amount or the frequency of doing those like hard training sessions. And I think with a lot of, say, these sports, CrossFit's a prime example of that. It's like, well, I have to do 3 Metcons a day in order to keep up with like the amount of volume. Like what's your rationale and what's your recommendation, to somebody who would be concerned about something like that? I definitely have like kind of my feelings on it, but I would just like to hear like what you would recommend to somebody who came to you. Hey, I want to improve my strength, but I'm nervous about reducing my frequency. Like, I need to do my 3 WODs a day or whatever.
Yeah. Well, first of all, 3 watts a day, how are you measuring that is optimal, right? We know that some of the best people have done that, right? But do you have the genetics that can support that? Do you have the nutrition that can support that? First of all, if you can, that's great. But secondary, by replacing, let's just say a day or 3 times of doing WODs in a day with 1 time of doing a WOD in a day and 1 strength training session, how much are you going to lose of that WOD fitness by dropping 2 of those WODs or even 1 of those WODs? To be honest, you'd probably be better off not even doing any WODs. If that was your training kind of program for 6 days a week, if you're doing 3 WODs a day, there's no way that you're adapting from 3 WODs a day. Like there's just no way. And I'm not saying that you're not still improving. I'm just saying you're not adapting from all of those. And depending, like I should caveat, it depends how big those WODs are, or how intense they are.
Right.
I'm talking relative, like if you're balls out doing WODs, which most people do, balls out. There's no way you're adapting to that. I don't think. And you will get better and you're adapting a little bit, but you're not fully adapting, would be my guess. And honestly, you have to experiment with things, because if you're trying to get better, you have to experiment. There's not a single person on this planet that just gets everything right their first try.
And as much as we would want to get it right the first try.
Exactly. So if you go out and replace 2 of your WODs in one of those days with strength training, or do that a couple times a week, if your performance goes down over a month, then it goes down, and like, hey, I got to figure out a different way to do that.
Yeah.
But if you're monitoring and week by week it's going down, you can pull the trigger after 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Right. And I highly doubt that to be the case. And what I say is always take the most conservative line. So for example, if you're doing 3 wads a day, take out one of those and replace it with a strength training. Right. If we're just talking this 1 day a week that you're doing it, or whatever, it's 3 days a week that you're doing this.
Right.
3 days out of the 6 days that you're training, take out one of those wads and do a strength training. You see how you respond to that.
Yeah.
If you're improving, right, or you're still maintaining and your strength's going up, take out another one, right, and see how you're doing, and just add a little bit more volume to the strength. Right. And then keep going and find your limit and say like, hey, is my strength going up as a plateau? And that's what I would say to that individual.
Yeah.
That's a pretty easy one though, but it's a very common one where people think,
yeah. No, I mean, I would say the exact same thing. I think we have, as an athletic society, this overemphasis or obsession with how much volume we can get in. And somehow we wear that as like a badge of honor, right? Oh, I see these Ironman athletes training 40 hours a week. Well, that's all great, but like, is 40 hours a week optimal?
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Your training is just a mode to get you the best performance possible on game day, right?
Yeah.
So I love exactly how you were described it. Like, if you're nervous about this, maybe say, let's take, I'll go the endurance athlete side of things. Like, let's take an endurance athlete. Let's say we'll reduce, like one of your longer sessions, from 2 hours to 1 hour. And then in that second hour, on whatever day it is, we'll do some level of strength training. Oh, you're seeing improvements in your power output, your, performance, your recovery, all of that sort of stuff. Let's reduce that a little bit more, because at the end of the day, you want to do the least amount of work that's going to give you the biggest benefits.
Yeah.
And I think people get caught in this trap of, especially with like social media, like things like Strava and all of that, like all of like the like the bragging on social media, right? Like, oh, I just crushed like 17 segments on Strava today, when in all actuality my Whoop says I'm at 14% recovery. I could probably do a little bit more strength training because I can't even lift a box up or anything like that. And I'm just in this chronic state of like, exercising 30 hours a week. So then I don't have any time to recover, any time for my family, or any life outside of, just training and work. But yeah, I all that rant aside to say, I totally agree with exactly what you were saying. I think that it's important to experiment with your training, because like you said, not everybody gets it right, the first time. And, you may be one of those people that can accumulate massive amounts of volume. But again, is that optimal for you?
Yeah. And, another point on this is what are you putting in your body? Like, carbohydrates is a super important factor for both, right? You need, especially if you're doing concurrent training, first of all, you need high amounts of leucine rich foods. So it's an amino acid that comes in protein. That's signaling for, it increases mTOR signaling, all this stuff. But regardless of size, leucine aside, just eat a lot of protein, right?
Yeah.
Even probably, especially if you're new to concurrent training, eat in a surplus. You're going to reduce a lot of the stress that you're going to get from trying to like maintain calories when you're doing this shit. Eating a surplus for a little while, it will aid in your adaptations, and it will aid with easing into the transition. And carbohydrates, we know this. Like, if you go out with some glycogen depletion and go into the gym, you're not going to get the same amount of quality. And the same vice versa for endurance, especially with low level endurance exercise. It's not affected as much, but like we've seen with the actual fibers interfering with the work, the same goes with glycogen. As you go up in higher intensity, those sessions are going to be impaired more by being in a lower carbohydrate state. So those two things. The other thing is, you need a base for for both these things provide a base. Strength provides a base of tissue tolerance and tissue capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get stronger and you have a strength base, it's building a base for endurance in a way that you can't get from endurance training. You know this by watching people run in ultra marathons and watch people go up
Yes.
hills, right? We know that the tendon does a lot of the work on flat ground, but whenever we isolate to the muscle itself and the muscle working like a motor and having to concentrically attract in large amounts and eccentrically contract in large amounts on hills, people that have better tissue tolerance and people that have higher strength outputs are going to be more economical at those paces, and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
be more economical doing that type of work. And then on the other side of that, for the CrossFitter that does 3 WODs in a day, or the strength athlete that's lifting 5-6 times a week high loads, to recover from that, you want a better ejection fraction. You want to have a strong heart. You want to have more blood vessels going
Mm-hmm.
into the tissue. You want a base of cardiovascular fitness to recover from that. And that's the thing, especially if you're doing 3 WODs a day. What kind of endurance base do you have to support those 3 WODs a day? I'd
Yeah.
be kind of, curious to see what kind of endurance base. Like, the more endurance base that you build, the more that you're going to be able to go out and actually do those 3 WODs a day and adapt from,
Mm-hmm.
something similar to that.
Yeah.
It's going to improve your ability to recover. And the same with the strength on that side of the WOD person. Like, the more you can lift, the more tissue capacity, tissue tolerance you're going to have to those 3 WODs. But on the strength training side, yes, endurance, low level endurance activity 3 times a week for 20 to 30 minutes is not going to impair your strength gains.
Right.
So go out and do that, because it will pay dividends in your ability to recover. You're not going to build a huge, massive aerobic engine doing that, but
Mm-hmm.
you are going to start, building the base that's going to further increase your ability to recover. So yeah, I think, like, the big takeaways of, we're going to talk about supplemental training, specifically for endurance athletes in another episode. So we're going to talk about that. Will probably be a couple episodes long, but we're going to talk about, if you're an endurance athlete and you're looking to improve performance, we're probably going to do an episode for runners specifically, and an episode for cyclists, sorry. Because there's different things to take in consideration there. We're going to do an episode on those, but for the hybrid athlete, lots of carbohydrates, lots of protein. Manage, what background are you coming from? What's your training history?
Mm-hmm.
Have you spent 10 years doing cross country and marathons, or have you spent, 10 years in the weight room, bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, or even, CrossFit? And understand that that's going to have a big effect. So, introduce things slowly. So if you're a runner, introduce strength training slowly. You're going to get huge stimulus right off the bat from lifting weights. So don't go out and do 5 days a week of strength training. Not going to be beneficial for you. And if vice versa, if you're, a strength training athlete, don't go out right away and do, like, 4 or 5 days a week of endurance training. Start with 1 or 2, even 10 minutes on the bike to start with, like, just getting the habit built in.
Mm-hmm.
Then also understand spacing out your sessions. Space them out to the best of your ability. Optimally is a session on every other day. So strength training on every other day, and then the endurance in between those. If you can't, then space them out the other end of the day. And if you can't, space them out at least 3 hours. And if you can't, fuck it, just do them all in one session.
Right.
You're probably still going to be okay, unless you're at a certain volume.
Yeah, unless you're doing crazy amounts of volume.
Exactly. So, and then the other thing is just manage your volume. Understand when you're hitting the threshold of volume where you need to start taking in more considerations.
Right.
When you're under a certain amount in volume, you don't really have to take a ton of things into consideration. But whether you're a CrossFit athlete, high rocks, whether you're just a hybrid athlete, ultra marathons and powerlifting, once you hit a certain threshold of training, understand you're starting to get into that area where, hey, I got to start paying attention, start organizing things more appropriately.
Yeah. And I think, one really easy way of being able to tell if you are pushing that volume too high is if you can no longer progressively overload your either side of your training. If you're hitting plateaus, there's probably some level of interference going on. So, use that as a marker. Like say you go and you do your squats every other day, and the first like 4 weeks you go from like 135 to 155 to 175. If all of a sudden that 175 remains at 175 for like 2-3 weeks, that's probably an indication that your volume may be getting a little bit too high, or you've kind of maxed out your adaptations. So using that as a little bit of a gauge, I think is an adequate way of estimating where that threshold is for pushing your volume. Pushing your volume during your training.
Yeah. So, this is a popular subject nowadays. And, heed just basic laws of nature. Like if you're trying to just do what you would think is the smartest, like if you sit down and think about a lot of this stuff, a lot of it, you don't need to read a textbook, or you don't need to read a piece of research to understand, oh yeah, that makes the most sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just the order of sequence, like, Phil was talking about earlier. If you're wanting to get better at something, take priority to doing that first when you're fresh. As it's just like, if you want to do good work, you're not going to put it at 12 o'clock at night unless you're an artist or something weird creative.
Like, some night owl who actually gets gets inspired at night.
Yeah. So yeah, that if you have any questions on this, like this is a huge topic. It's really hard to do it in an hour.
Yeah.
You're skimming the surface, but I mean, really the takeaways of it, it's, reasonable to do in an hour, because there's not a huge amount of takeaways, but I'm sure you probably learned something in here, regardless of whatever the type of athlete you are. So hopefully you did. Yeah. So, if you want to find Phil, he's at Critical Vo2 on Instagram.
Yep.
Hit him up. He has, he puts out pretty much daily content, whether one or two posts a day.
Yeah, that's what I try to do.
On, science related stuff, and also just like really applicable based stuff for, just everyday athletes or people trying to stay fit. Hit him up if you have any questions on the stuff that he's putting out or anything that we put out in the podcast. And I'm at Resilience HPC on Instagram and YouTube. I barely post anymore. I was just getting swamped lately, but I post like whenever the podcast's coming out. I'm going to start doing more videos once I get a little bit more time here. But yeah, you can find me on there and hit me up if you have any questions.
So, thanks everybody for all the support and everything. And I really appreciate you, letting me know if and when you listen to the podcast, and any suggestions you may have. It always helps us, to get listener feedback, because that's, at the end of the day, we're trying to serve all of you as coaches and athletes who want to get better. So, feel free to DM both of us with, podcast suggestions, interview suggestions, all of that sort of stuff. Until next time, we'll keep training hard, and we'll see you guys later.